As an aside, I'm curious now, what are the elements of the skills and training that can make a scientist a good communicator to the public? Like, how does the information have to be repackaged to make it effective?
Oh, that is a very good question. And the best answer still, I think, was given by Aristotle 2,300 years ago. So he wrote a treatise on rhetoric. And scientists need to, if they want to get into science communication, they need to learn rhetoric.
This ethos, pathos,
and logos, ethos, pathos, and logos. So those three are the three aspects of persuasion, the three components of persuasion according to Aristotle. Logos is the only one that scientists actually manage. Logos means you have to get your facts straight and your arguments sound. Because if you don't, then you're just bullshitting, and or you're speaking out of ignorance, and you shouldn't do it, right? And that's what scientists focus on, because they've been trained to do that, to focus on the logos. The ethos has to do with character and credibility. You have to be credible and make a connection with your audience, because otherwise they're not going to listen to you. And credibility doesn't mean just putting PhD after your name or MD after your name. It means you really have to connect to people. And most scientists are not capable of connecting with broader audiences. Again, they're not trained to do that. That's not their job usually. While on the other hand, science communicators do that because that's what they're trained to do. And the one that really gets scientists upset and railed up is the pathos. Pathos means emotional. Yeah, you have to make an emotional connection with your audience. And this is often put negatively in terms of, you mean that I have to manipulate my audience. It's not a question of manipulating. It's a question of making sure the audience understand why the hell they should care about what you're saying. You have to make a connection. So you use anecdotes, you use personal stories, things like that, because you want to make the connection. If you just present a bunch of graphs and spreadsheets, people are going to zoom out immediately. I'm going to fall asleep after the third slide with a graph or a table on it. It's just like it's not engaging. So if scientists want to engage in that kind of communication to the general public, then they need to be aware of rhetorics. They have to be aware of what they're doing and be trained in what they're doing. And most of them are not, which is why I'm very suspicious of scientists who turn science communicators.
Yeah, one problem for the scientist is that the pseudoscientist or conspiracy theory monger also has access to the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, though maybe their logos isn't going to be as well informed. But you mentioned telling anecdotes, stories, these sorts of things. If somebody like RFK, who clearly has a great ability to develop rapport with people through interviews, starts telling stories about people who are quote unquote vaccine injured, that is immediately going to evoke sympathy from his target audience. And Peter Hotez, well, I guess he can tell stories about how vaccines have saved people's lives, but it's just a fundamental fact of psychology that we're extremely loss averse. And if we hear one story about a child becoming autistic purportedly from a vaccine, that's much more painful or damaging to us than is the story of 1,000 children who are uplifted out of sickness from a vaccine.
That's right. That's correct. Now, however, the difference you just pointed out, that is RFK doesn't have the right logos, that's fundamental. That's important. That is why he's wrong, presumably. And scientists tend to be on the right side of things. But yes, of course, everybody can use the other two components of Aristotle's rhetorical advice, and that is why it's very difficult. That's why it's an art that requires serious application. Now, look, I think I won maybe a couple of debates in my career against creationists, and in both cases was because I punched below the belt. And I had, in fact, once I realized that, I had no compulsion whatsoever in doing it.
What constitutes punching below the belt against an a creationist?
Character assassination, for instance, which is one of the things that Aristotle says you should do. You should undermine the credibility of your opponent. In both cases, that's what I did. In one case, Duane Gish was my opponent. He died a few years ago, but he was a big deal in the Institute for Creation Research. And he was doing lots of debate, like hundreds of debates a year. He was a professional debater. However, one day I caught him lying. He presented a slide with a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, the noted evolutionary biologist, and it looked like the slide was implying that Gould didn't believe in evolution, which I knew couldn't possibly be the case. Now, I didn't know where the slide was coming from, so I just made a note, and I said, I'm going to look it up and see what happens. I did find the quote, but I also found that the quote ended with a comma, after which Gould said, but of course, nobody in his right mind believes that kind of stuff, period. So it was obviously a manipulation of a quote out of context. And then, okay, fine. So I made a slide with the full quote from Gould, and I knew that I was going to run into Gish again, which I did a few months later. And he pulled up exactly the same slide, because when you do hundreds of debates a year, you don't have time to update your stuff. You just, it becomes, you always give the same spiel. And when he got to that point, I thought, I got him. And sure enough, I showed the slide with the complete quote. He got really upset. He started saying things like, I cannot possibly quote the entire book. I said, well, maybe not the entire book, but, the entire sentence, perhaps. It's, something that you could manage. And afterwards, several of his supporters came to me to thank me, and they were surprised and disappointed that Gish had to, rely with that kind of trick in order to make his point. So there, I made a dent, and it was because I basically went not after the facts, but after scientific facts. I went after the character of the person that was on the other side of the debate. The second case was very similar. Jonathan Wells, who was a leading member of the Discovery Institute in Seattle. It's a think tank that is devoted to intelligent design. And he has this story that he tells people about, he was really not that interested in biology, but he finally there was something that didn't quite feel right. So he went back to school and he got a PhD in molecular biology with the express purpose of figuring out things. And then he discovered that everything was a lie, et cetera, et cetera. It's a nice story, but it's not true. The story, when I did some research, turns out that he was told to get a PhD in molecular biology for the precise purpose of undermining evolutionary arguments. And he was told to do so by the Reverend Moon. And when I pointed that out in an audience full of Southern Baptists, I literally heard a gasp in the audience, because Southern Baptists, as it turned out, don't like Moonists. They just hate each other. And so once they discovered that this speaker not only had lied to them, but in fact had omitted a fundamental aspect of his CV, then he lost the audience. Now, was that fair? Yep. Because if you're lying to your audience, it is fair game for your opponent to point that out, to undermine your ethos. That's where Aristotle was right. But most scientists wouldn't do that. They would, go high and go above the fray and just stay on the high road and all that sort of stuff. And I say, bullshit. It's not going to work. If you really decide to do that, my first piece of advice would be, don't do it. But if you want to do it, then you have to play using all three of the areas of rhetoric allowed by Aristotle, not just the logos.
Your story about the Gould quote really illuminates something, I think, about the psychology of debates and persuasion, in that the facts, the science, are much more abstract and difficult to appraise, whereas we judge someone's character so viscerally, and whether it's rational or not, if we come to dislike or distrust someone, we then just immediately discount everything that they say.
Yeah, that's right. And, is that rational? No, but it's human. And since we're not talking about debating perfectly rational people, we're talking about, or entities, we're talking about debating human beings, and we're talking about an audience of human beings, not an audience of, logical algorithms. So you have to take that into account. If you don't, then you're undermining your own position and you're doing a lot more damage than good.